Thank you all for having me. And I realized that JP was going to use my military photo in the brochure. I wasn't sure how you're all going to react to that. I kind of catch the East Coast news and was wondering if I was going to be coming through some protest signs and all that, but your professor assured me that this is the conservative school in California and that I'd be well received. But if it helps you, instead of kind of picturing me, that photo was actually taken the day before I retired. And when one of my daughters looks at it, she goes, "Dad, that just makes my heart hurt." The look on my face, because I was processing a lot of things at that point. I already knew that I was under consideration to be the director of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. The thought of leading 39,000 staff was a little intimidating, with a population of incarcerated of, at that time, about 183,000, I believe. And just that shift from military culture to, Lord forbid, crossing the Potomac and being part of the Department of Justice was a little bit intimidating. But when I think about who I really am, and I just want to put this out there for you so it might help with our communication back and forth, is don't view me as that. Picture me as a high school freshman. I entered high school at 4'11" with the last name of Inch. I was in the marching band. I was a cashier at Jewel Food Store. And yes, I was on the debate team. Needless to say, I wasn't the most popular guy in school. But you can still make it. Now, I'll tell you, I wish I had been here a year and a half ago when I was still Secretary of Florida Department of Corrections, because I would have left here with at least 4 of your names and contact information with the intent of trying to recruit you. When I look at, just look out on your faces, and this sounds like I'm so old saying this, I'm excited that you're interested in criminal justice. I just want to have you be inside the system instead of criticizing from outside the system. I certainly have interacted a lot with academia and have drawn great insights from research and work in academia. My father was a college professor, wrote 60 books on theology. Amazing man. But he was always on the outside of the system looking in. I've absolutely worked with advocacy groups, sometimes in a collaborative way, other times with the help of lawyers communicating our respective issues. And it was very distracting. In this current expression of life, where the Major General retired, we do the initials MG parentheses R. Really, in my life, that R stands for recovering. It's doing this life change from public service to being back out in community has really been very interesting. Running this now for about 15 months. I was telling the other judges how I've tried to turn my life into a pie of three sections. A third of my life, yes, I really do want to slow down. I have a life goal of breaking 100 in golf. I have not achieved that yet, but having time to do that. Have 8 grandchildren now. Love playing with them. I'll see 2 of them next week. Getting involved in community, and when you're in the military, I've moved a lot in my life, so getting involved in a community is great. Really slowing down and investing in family relationships, community relationships. About a third of my time is doing things like this, kind of in pro bono. I'm very involved in prison ministry, with Crossroad Prison Ministries. I'm on their board of directors, Correctional Ministers and Chaplains Association, their board of advisors. I do mentorship of wardens as part of Prison Fellowship's Warden Exchange program, great program, that is, I think, causing great change in our profession. And then a third of my life, yes, I'd love to get people to pay me for my opinion so that I can pay off my mortgage. You'll find a realistic side to me as we go into the question and answer period. But if I had been here a year and a half ago, I would have been listening with, my ears listening to two things: your actual presentations and the merits of your argument and deciding on the merits that you present. But the other half, I'd be looking at your potential. So I'm kind of hoping what we can do today is, if you allow me just to role play back a year and a half ago, which I find as a consultant, that's what everybody wants me to do. If you were secretary, how would you react to this presentation or expert testimony and the like? But if I were looking at you for potential internships with the Florida Department of Corrections, I want to kind of give you an idea of what I'd be looking at, and for perhaps what value that might provide you if you are thinking of trying to work inside the system for change, as opposed to the other routes for advocacy within the corrections profession. You see, the first thing I would want to know is, do you have a foundation? I mean, do you really understand what our criminal justice system's about? I suspect you do. I suspect that will be clearly evident. If I were to ask you for the 4 classic reasons for corrections, or even for a criminal justice system, I'm sure you could tell me one of them is retribution. That's true. Based on the laws of our state and our nation, we use the system to exact retribution for crime on behalf of society in upholding the rule of law, and on behalf of victims of crime. You would know that there's an expectation of incapacitation for those who are incarcerated, meaning they should not be able to, during the period of incarceration under our control, be able to victimize again, to do criminal behavior. It's tough work, especially when you're short-staffed, because there's criminal activity. There are those who decide to continue to live a criminal lifestyle. And no matter your effort with them, they choose to prey upon their fellow incarcerated man or woman, as well as even outside the wire through the many contraband communication capabilities that exist, to victimize outside the wire. That shouldn't happen. Incapacitation means that shouldn't happen. Third, deterrence. Okay, I got to be honest here. I personally don't buy much into deterrence. I certainly don't buy into the thought that if you make your correctional system austere, that somehow increases the deterrent effect of your system. Because most men and women I have met committed crime under the influence of something. Drugs and alcohol, obvious. Intense emotion. Impacts of whatever their life's experience had been that somehow were triggered at that point in time. Folks with serious mental issues. I'm sure you've all read the studies of the deinstitutionalization of mental health, and where we went from, try to remember all my figures now, of the number of beds per 100,000. What did it used to be, John, in the 34 beds per 100,000 in institutional capability, way more than we should have had. And I won't comment of the institutions of the 1950s and 60s, but when we dropped down to like 3%, we're the right number, I don't know, 6 to 10%, somewhere up there, that folks that really need institutional care, maybe. You can go back and help me with figures there, John, on that. But it's clear that a lot of those individuals become justice involved, and they're inside the institutions. Who actually steps back and in a rational way says, I might get caught, I might get 10 years. Maybe I'm not going to do this crime right now. No, actually, most men and women I've talked to have said, I wish I had just counted to 10 and not done what impulse had me do at that time. And that's an amazing thing when you make that conversation with somebody that's been incarcerated for 40 years and they drop back to that one point in their life. So deterrence, I just don't put much stake in it. And in fact, I really rail against those who would want to make, again, a prison an austere, punitive environment intentionally, thinking that's going to somehow improve the criminal justice system. Fourth reason, of course, is rehabilitation. Very broad views on rehabilitation. We can talk programming, everything from substance use program, mental health treatment, to vocational training, to straight education. In Florida Department of Corrections, average reading level of a newly incarcerated person is 6th grade. 32% read 5th grade and below. There's a need for some basic education, and we all know the studies that show education reading level in comparison to recidivism levels. Correlation, we can argue if it's causation, but the aspect across this whole group of activities that need to be funded or supported through volunteers is critical. I mean, that's why we call it the corrections profession, and not the prison profession. Don't ask me why the Federal Bureau of Prisons is still called the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Had I stayed longer, might have tried to change that. Most departments will have corrections in their name. But in my mind, there is a fifth reason, and I had a chance to put that out with an op-ed. I don't know if any of you did your Google search trying to figure out what this one judge was going to be like, because I don't think I'm the typical person to stand in front of you. I did an op-ed when the First Step Act got hung up in the Senate Judiciary Committee. If you can remember back to that time, it was kind of being held up by, from the Republican side, certainly to take away additional aspects that were in the First Step Act that was being pushed, of course, very hard by Jared Kushner. And so I wrote in defense of the First Step Act, saying it is a good first step, only first step, but that it was appropriate. I had already left the Bureau of Prisons due to matters of conscience with the Attorney General I was serving under at the time. And so, but I put my voice out there, and I added a fifth reason for corrections in that op-ed, and that was restoration. Now, I'm not talking about restorative justice, even though that's important, in creating opportunities for victims and the offenders to interact, if the victims want to. No, for restoration, to me, is for those of us inside the profession, that we should work with intent with community to facilitate the re-entry of the returning citizen. Work with intent. See, in the criminal justice system, and I don't know if you guys have experiences, start with the prosecutors. I mean, those prosecutors, when they're done, they get their score. I got 10 years. And I'm not sure they really think what happens after that. Well, unfortunately, on the correction side, that some people kind of affectionately call us the tail end of the corrections criminal justice system, that after they go out the sally port, that's it. In fact, some would even view it as a cold handoff, because there is cold handoff between correctional facilities and going to the community. Now, in Florida, about a third of our men and women that are released have a dual sentence of follow-on probation. A third. Turn that around. That means 2/3, it's a cold handoff to community. And for those that have lost contact with family, there's a significant number. For those that really can't return to their community, can you imagine the anxiety if you put yourself in the shoes of this individual? The anxiety of your day of release when you have a bus ticket and a little debit card of $50, and to the best of the ability of the transition specialist, really you don't have a plan? I can only imagine that kind of anxiety. Well, what I think corrections agencies should do is they should work with intent with community, raising first the awareness of the returning citizen. Absolutely, because there's many in community that would never, if they knew this was going on right now, would ever even think of showing up just to listen and learn and to become more aware. Vast majority would not, obviously. But especially in state corrections, where there is contact, because all your correctional officers are of community, your volunteers are coming from community, and there's an ability to work with intent to facilitate that reentry. And I consider that an actual mission, something that should be funded. Something key about, if you want a little hint about working in government, it's so easy to see priorities. Follow the money. It's that easy. It's a priority if it's funded. It's just rhetoric if it is not. A hard truth. And so there should be funds earmarked towards this actual engagement with community to facilitate reentry. What would be wonderful in my mind as a Secretary of Corrections is that if every man and woman that was leaving our custody and control knew their situation for housing, already had a job, and then the hard one, had civic acceptance going back to the community they're going back to. Starting with family. Unfortunately, there's some situations where that can't be family, but starting with family. Second, I lean towards, I won't be shy about my faith-based community. 9 out of 10 of our volunteers in Florida came from the faith-based community. I suspect that follows a lot of other systems as well. But also the secular organizations. For veterans, does the VFW accept, a soldier that had a dishonorable discharge that then had another confining offense and comes out? Will that veteran community accept them? I'm actually was very honored to be invited to the council, to be a member of the Council of Criminal Justice. And subordinate to that, 15 of us were asked to serve on the Veterans Justice Commission. And so we're doing a 3-year, and if you're not familiar with CCJ, it's a nonpartisan think tank built on the model of the Council on Foreign Affairs, certainly out of DC, and you can look it up. But we're doing a 3-year study to make recommendations on diversionary things that we can do to address veterans that become justice involved, how to make advice to the military to facilitate, especially those who are leaving under other than honorable conditions, and then certainly the corrections and reentry effort for how we address veterans in incarceration. I feel very privileged to be a part of that. But all that works to what I hope you're hearing is a holistic approach to corrections. I will not apologize for carrying out the sentences of the laws of the state for the time. Now, we can have a great discourse, and I've been in discourse of what is just. What is just sentencing? There's a lot we can talk on that about, but the state being allowed to have laws that provide retribution on behalf of community and the victims of crime, I'm very comfortable with carrying that out. Just look at me. I'm very comfortable carrying that out, and I will compete. Sorry, I know we're not supposed to be competing. I will compete with those incarcerated that choose to continue to live a criminal lifestyle and do everything I can to carry out my mission of incapacitation, using every tool available. Unapologetically. Again, deterrence, just kind of throw that to the wind. If you view this kind of as a justice mercy balance, fine, put deterrence in the center. That doesn't affect the balance of the activity that we're doing. But I will fight for the same amount of money that I'm trying to do for security. I will fight for that for programming and for reentry. Absolutely. Because that approach is the most effective. Safe and secure facilities allow for effective programs. Effective programmed, resource programmed facilities are safe and secure. Especially if you can address that element who chooses not to participate and you're able to do it effectively. So that would be the first thing is I would want you to know, and I was encouraged to I was seeing some heads going up and down. You had actually heard the words before. Good. Hopefully I defined them correctly. I'd actually look at some professionals. You got to remember, I'm a Biblical Archaeology major, which was really funny when I was advising the Secretary of the Army on the first real transgender issue we had in the military was Chelsea Manning. And this was very early in the process of addressing transgender issues in corrections, and we were under federal interaction with the courts with that, and trying to explain transitioning from somebody with my background to somebody with the then Secretary of the Army's background. And, we're trying to find all the right words. And I finally had to go, sir, you got to understand, I've never taken a criminal justice course in my life. Now, I'm the senior law enforcement advisor to the Secretary of the Army. Granted, I had a lot of experience, but and I've done a lot of reading, a lot of workshops and stuff like that. But just to break the ice is like, sir, it's okay for us to kind of mess up the words here. We're going to get through it. Let me just help explain what's going on. But anyways, if you were going to come work to me, I would want you to have a foundation. But then the second thing I would want is if you're coming to work for me in an organization I'd lead, I would want you to make a conscious agreement to join the corrections profession. Now, what I'd be doing is very significant, by the way. Because whenever you join a profession, be it name your profession in the medical fields, in the legal fields, in the, just name, actual professions, sectors of the society that have shared values, defined language and competence levels, and a commitment to the profession. That's a significant step. And for me, the defining of the corrections profession is something we're still doing as a profession. I had a chance, before I took over as the director of the Bureau of Prisons, to just sit in on the board meeting for the National Institute of Corrections. Great professionals around that table from both inside our profession and then those that advise from outside. NIC is administered by the Bureau of Prisons, but it is independent and is independent in thought, at least for those administrations that allow that. But anyways, I listened for the first day, just listening to the discussion and how they were prioritizing the efforts and the grants that they were managing and the like. But by the second day, even though I wasn't the director yet, which would have given me a at the table board, I just moved up there. And when it came around, I just looked at the group and said, hey, can anybody show me like a 10-page white paper that defines the corrections profession that we all kind of agree to? I can show you that for the Army. I can show you that for the armed forces. In fact, who had the leadership in that? General Martin Dempsey. And it's agreed upon, and then it's taught, and it's enforced, and it's become part of our culture. We actually don't have that in corrections. So in the Bureau of Prisons, the first thing I wanted to look at is, okay, what are our shared values? Went to the website. It was respect, integrity, and correctional excellence. That just didn't do it for me. I mean, respect and integrity, I'll buy into that all day. Correctional excellence is kind of a competence. So if that moves over into the competence category, that we just kind of want to be the best, that leaves us with shared values of respect and integrity. Is that it? So I did an exercise with the executives the 17, assistant directors of the Bureau. And, we put up different values, virtues, if you want to use the term. We don't want to go too philosophical because Dr. Gannon will just run circles around me. But I put them on there and says, what do we want our men and women staff to have foremost in their mind every day when they're making decisions? Because what we're doing is, with shared values, what that really does is it builds trust in your organization. If you have confidence that the men and women of your organization choose to believe in these shared values and practice them, you can trust them in their decision making. Of the thousands of decisions that are being made that day by 39,000 staff. And as we worked through it, we added courage, we added selfless service, and at the very end, I added compassion. So if I was interviewing you, and I could call on you. I taught at West Point for 3 years, and I can tell when somebody needs to be called on, but I won't. But if I asked one of you, define for me respect, can someone just raise your hand and give me your definition of respect, please, sir?
Empathy.
Empathy. That's a good answer, and I would think hard on empathy. But I'm going to come back to that under compassion. Okay, I like that. It's a thought that you're thinking about the other person and their feelings in the situation. Please. Okay, recognizing their individuality and being sensitive to that. I like that. Man. Meeting people at their level. This is great, sir, former Marine. The golden rule. Thank you. The golden rule, which, when my mom used to say that to me, I thought it was from the Bible. She said it was such solemnity. It actually is. And in fact, if you look at most faith traditions, there's some type of injunction for treating others as you want to be treated, that reciprocity. But what happens when you can't actually have that expectation that you're going to be treated well? Do you still treat somebody with respect, dignity and respect? The answer is yes. Sometimes I just try to simplify things. And in my mind, respect is, don't be a jerk. I mean, everybody understands that, right? Don't be a jerk. Be kind. You'll get such a response. I mean, we had a problem in the many systems, but in Florida, staff using the term inmate as a title in their conversations with our incarcerated. Inmate, whatever your last name, who cares what your last name is? Inmate, go do that. That's kind of a jerky thing to do. I would use the term, sir, if you don't mind, could you, I fully expect you to do exactly what I said, but it doesn't hurt to say, would you? And if I know your name, say, Mr., I don't know your name, but to use the name, I would expect the correctional officer to do that. It was a culture change to say, we have to make this personal. But the thing that just seemed to work the best was, don't be a jerk. Certainly do not demean, do not devalue, do not degrade. Sometimes it's the opposites are easier to see than the affirmative. But respect is important. And by the number of hands went up, I think I sense from you that you see that that's important in communications. How about integrity? How would you define integrity? Ma'am. Excellent. I like that. Please. Be true to yourself. Sir. Being consistent with saying what you do. We all have, internal, moral reasoning. We all have a recognition of the rules, the legalities and the boundaries that are put upon us. And there's actually an expectation from guys like in my position and gals in my position to look and expect the staff to behave ethically. And we watch. So, telling the truth, obviously, is something we'd expect of ethical behavior. Does anybody in here golf? Do we have any golfers? Okay, so like, how good are you? Okay, but you've broken 100, haven't you? Yeah. So, my whole military career, we do golf scrambles with our units. It's fun. It's camaraderie building. You play, you play best ball and all that. And every team has a B, C, D player. Yeah, D player. So, but there's something I noticed when doing these golf scrambles, because for some reason the sergeant major and the first sergeant would come up with wonderful gifts for the flights, and so there was a prize at the end if your team did well. And I typically wouldn't see players of my skill do this. I would see the good players do this, where they'd come up to their ball, they'd look at it, they'd look over at the flag, they take their ball and they'd move it and put it on a little tuft of grass. And you go, excuse me, what are you doing? He says, winter rules. I'm improving my lie. You know what I was seeing? A lie. Think of this. Someone would sell their reputation for honesty so cheaply as to improve their golf score by 2 or 3 strokes. And do you think I would ever trust that person again? No. Because, our personal integrity is something we own. No one can take that away from us. No one. We can only give it away. And across the criminal justice system, investigators, you heard in my bio that I ran, the organization is called CID, not as popular as NCIS because they got a TV show. Do you know that show was offered to the Army first? And the general of that time running CID said no. Yeah, epic failure. So, but for the record, who's the forensic scientist? What's her name? Gabby. She has to work for the Army because DOD's forensic lab is run by the Army. I was in charge of that, so it is a cool place. Where was I? This is where I see if you've been paying attention. I don't pay attention to what I say. No, where was I? Oh, okay, we hadn't got to compassion yet. So just finishing up with integrity is for a CID investigator. Yeah, this happens more and more, trust me, as you get older. If you lie in an official report, your career is over as a felony investigator. Literally over, because you cannot testify in court again, because you will be challenged. And, you lied on one report. Well, how do we know you're telling the truth now? Well, you can't. Testimony thrown. It's that important. It's that important. People need to know it's that important. Courage. Let me hear your definitions of courage. Now you're talking to an Army guy. Courage. Sir? Confidence and risk reward. Yes. Sir? Thank you. Hold on to that thought. Bravery. The way I divide it up is between physical courage, and yes, has anybody actually been inside a prison before in this group? Okay, so a few of you have. Were you nervous? I was taking my wife. So I've been married twice. I was married for 27 years and lost Barbara to cancer. And then I ended up marrying, we had never met before, but the senior victim assistance advisor policy advisor for the Department of Defense. So for military sex crimes, senior victim response advisor. But anyways, the first time I took Betty to a prison, of course, I'd been in easily 100 prisons, and we're just walking the exercise yard. We're heading out to observe a veterans unit. And the group is walking, of course, the warden's on one side and the regional director's on the other, and we're just walking out, and Betty's walking behind. And I looked over my shoulder and I saw her face. And I went, oops, forgot what was a normal environment and that I understood the cues. This was all new, and we were walking across an exercise yard. Again, most prisons is open general population and movement. And I had to remember that, first I was very impressed with her, the courage she just displayed coming in. I might have gotten an earful after, but it was quite a realization to remember, especially early in their career, the physical courage it takes to go into such environments. And that is important. But you hit on the moral courage, where if I was defining courage, 10% physical, 90% moral. There's I did a teaching assignment at West Point. If you wonder, how does a military guy get a geography degree with a focus in the Middle East and Africa? It's because they have decided you're going to teach for a rotation at the military academy. And so being at the military academy, we decided to attend the cadet chapel. And at the chapel, they have a very long cadet prayer. It was written, 100 years ago. But and it's worth looking up and just reading it. It's in my mind, it doesn't matter your faith tradition or if you approach your spirituality from a humanistic perspective. It's an amazing aspirational prayer. But at one part it says, Lord, help me to choose the harder right than the easier wrong. Because there's consequences when you stand up for what is not just. And that takes courage. Organizations should encourage that, not discourage that. Now, I can teach you good ways to bring that up. There's some very counterproductive ways to help your leadership see the errors of their ways. And there are ways that are done that are much better. But it does take courage to stand up for what is right. And that needs to be integral in any organization. Selfless service, boy, if you're doing it for the money, you are choosing the wrong profession. I'm still trying to understand how Dr. Gannon has a Jaguar. This, from my CID background, I think that's just probable cause for some investigation. But okay, I'm jealous of your car. But there is no way to ever think there's a financial reward equivalent to the level of sacrifice of any public service. And this whole idea of committing yourself to somebody else's betterment is absolutely commendable. With my father, he lived to 92, and about 6 weeks before he passed, it was in between. No, it doesn't matter when it was, but I was visiting him, and I had one of my nephews with me, and Robert asked my dad, "So what have you learned in your life?" And at 92 he was doing a blog. Can you imagine that? And so on it's called faithwriters.com. If you want to look this up, more cinch, look under what it's still up. What have I learned? And he did a one-pager of about 20 things important in his life he had learned. And the third one on there was the importance of service. And that, not only is it commendable, but it should be something we seek out, and that's where the best satisfaction. And there's plenty of quotes out there if you wanted to grab quotes of those in life in retrospect, recognize the satisfaction of a life of service. I mean, I'll just simply attest to you the satisfaction of having been able to impact the lives known and not known that I've been able to, because I was in positions to do so. In fact, that's the reason I actually had planned on becoming a chaplain in the Army. And about 6 weeks after being a lieutenant, and the situations I'd already been able to deal with way before that soldier would ever go to a chaplain, was when I did my personal covenant to the Lord and said, I will keep leading as long as I'm still in leadership positions. Never knew that was going to be 35 years and I'd end up at the top position for my career field. And then 2 more opportunities happening after. It is of such great satisfaction when you can be in an organization, shape an organization, move up in it, and cause positive things to happen. I'm really not sure how it feels to do it from the outside through the legal processes, or through pressures from the outside. I don't know how that feels. And then the last one, compassion. And that's where I heard you guys already talk about feeling for the other person, putting yourselves in the shoe of the incarcerated or of your staff, and how important that is. And that should be part of your decision making. In fact, if you were to come on an internship when I was secretary, one of the tasks I would have given you is have you sit visitation on a Saturday. Simply sit at one of our prisons, correctional institutions, for visitation, and simply feel what you're seeing between the incarcerated man and woman, and is it their parents visiting? Is it their spouse visiting? Is it their children visiting? And just try to wrap your mind around it. Because we have to be able to wrap our mind around that. If we can't, I've just, in our profession, you've probably done readings on compassion fatigue, compassion deficit. When somebody hits that stage in their life, anybody heard of the Stanford experiment? What a dorked up experiment that was. Yeah. That's what happens when you don't have trained people. That wasn't the environment. That was the lack of training of those that tried to be the correctional officers. They use the term guards. Never say guard. Never say guard. Those guys, you can call them guards. Because, they weren't trained correctional officers. They didn't have any of the tools to protect themselves from becoming what they became in 6 days. Compassion is important because it protects your own heart from becoming that. That's why compassion is important. It's obviously important for the person you're showing compassion to. See, if I'm confident that you buy into those 5 core values, I trust you. I have no worries about the decisions you're going to make where I'm going to have to provide you top cover for it. But if any one of those 5 are missing, I'm not going to take the risk. So that's the reality side of me coming out. I'm not going to take the risk on you if any of those 5. If somehow that doesn't resonate with you, we're just not going to play together. Now, there's also a side, I'm expecting competence. I'm impressed that you have achieved at this point not only acceptance into the schools you've been accepted into, but then onto the team, enough that you've impressed your coaches to represent your school. That's not a small accomplishment. And these types of accomplishments are going to come in your life upon graduation and as you enter the workforce. And a lot of it is going to be based on your competence. Now, competence without character, bad combination, because those people become the toxic leaders of whatever sector is out there. Yeah, bad combination, competence without character. But the competence has to be there. It has to be there. You want that for your organization, both corporately. In corrections profession, we have an accreditation process, not only for our facilities, for our central office, for our training and all that, through the American Correctional Association, where external auditors come in every 3 years and ensure you're following 547 or 74 standards. But, we also do it for, our medical departments and the like. Whatever the accreditations are, you want to have them. In all 3 systems I was in, the Army, the Bureau of Prisons, and the Florida Department of Corrections, I made sure that all three became not only 100% accredited, and in fact, they already were, so you just stay in the reaccreditation, but also compliant with the Prison Rape Elimination Act. Every facility. And in doing that, there's actually an award ACA does for that as well, of agencies that are fully accredited and fully PREA compliant, because it's the right thing to do. And you want your profession to tell you that, but you want to do that individually. You know, there's an academic underpinning, there is a language underpinning to any profession, an accepted body of literature that we're supposed to know. And through personal certifications, and I was certified as a certified corrections executive, passed the test. That's important in a profession. You want your profession to endorse your legitimacy. And that takes effort, but it's important. If you were going to intern with me, one of the things that would happen at the end of the internship would be taking the Certified Corrections Management Test and doing the process to pass that test. It's multiple choice. How hard can it be, right? It's hard. The hardest test I think I've ever taken was my Certified Corrections Executive test. It was a beast. And then the last part of being in a profession where I'd be looking as we interact is your commitment. Now, commitment is that, yes, you will take the personal responsibility to remain committed to the standards, both the ethical standards of our agency as well as the competence. That's a given, right? Here's the hard part of commitment, is making sure others are committed to the profession. Has anybody heard of the Blue Code? Or the Code of Silence? Come on, it's a Chuck Norris. Anybody know who Chuck Norris is? You're so young. No, that is so against what a profession does. Professions hold each other accountable, the members accountable. It should not require someone coming from the outside to enforce the standards of the profession. That's an offense. Prison Rape Elimination Act never should have had to have happened had the corrections profession stood up, addressed the problem, and put forward solutions. We relegated it to the federal legislature. That shouldn't be. Therefore, what's the big issue right now? Restricted housing. The corrections profession is working very hard to address the appropriate use of restricted housing. Because I don't want to hand that to the legislature. They aren't the professionals. We're the professionals, and we should figure that out. Okay. Then comes the most important part of any interview. And that's when the interview looks at you and says, and what are your questions of me? Always have questions, and make sure your questions demonstrate your competence, your character, and your potential commitment to the organization, because that will be what resonates with the person interviewing you. So let's do that. What are your questions of me? Sorry, your hand goes up first. I've noticed that.
Thank you again for...
Yeah, actually, before you ask your question, just give me your name and what school you're from.
My name is Robbie.
Robbie?
At the University of San Francisco.
Okay, wonderful. This is the San Francisco team. Okay, excellent.
Thank you again for speaking here on the really insightful about your experiences. And I guess the question I have too, that's okay.
Okay, sure.
So my first question is, to what extent do you believe that just sentencing also begins with our public defenders who represent individuals who go to court?
Okay, thank you for that question. So my expertise is certainly not in the legal system. My expertise was at the front end as a military police officer, up through the investigative process, and then on the other end of the court proceedings, as you would put it, with running correctional systems. That doesn't mean I did not interact both with prosecutors and defenders, right up to the senior levels of the military. So I guess I'm answering this where I'm not sure my opinion really makes that much of a difference, but I do have an opinion of the responsibilities of both prosecutors and defenders to work towards just sentencing. And I had difficulties personally with, not only some of the rhetoric and what appears to me, partisan politics in DA offices. And again, that goes both directions. Just doesn't matter, both directions. But when I think of defenders, that responsibility that they have to serve in their best ability, I gather, and I don't know this for a fact, is they must be as overworked as everybody else in the system, and probably negotiate maybe too soon in the process, where a more spirited defense maybe is appropriate. But this is me speaking as an uninformed guy from the panhandle of Florida.
Thank you for your question. My next question is, do you believe that more can be done to help individuals with low literacy rates to have a fair chance in court of law, and that by having resources allocated to them to help facilitate that communication?
So again, not my area of expertise, but that certainly would be my expectation of the courts. Of certainly there's requirements of translations, and we have that in corrections when we do any of our follow-on deliberations for whatever reason. So I think that's an absolute right. For me, it's certainly as a citizen, is an expectation that and I would even put it, it's not just language, but it's cultural as well. That there should be a sensitivity and understanding of the, this is my cultural geographer background coming out. So, yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Ali from the University of San Francisco. My question is, what should the industrial prison complex system look like to you?
Okay, so I'll give you now, please, nobody take offense when I react like a guy out of the corrections profession. So that would have been a horrible question if you were doing the interview, because you used the term industrial prison, was it complex, or that is not an accepted term within the corrections profession. That's not how we view ourselves. And some of the art of communication, as I'm sure your instructors tell you, is you speak to the other person's ear. You don't speak from your framework and your perspective. Now I know exactly what you're saying. So now I'll answer your question. Because correctional agency, that would be. So it's kind of funny. I'm helping a group that their platform is they are trying to encourage Florida not to have life sentence without parole, and the method they want to take is to actually do a pilot of a wraparound rehabilitative services of what they want to do is life sentence without parole, to then encourage the legislature to change the laws. But I've been working with them to help them present their case in a way that could be heard by the majority of Florida. And we've had like 4 sessions where I've been just, okay, stop, you can't say that. No, or that picture, you're trying to convince a Republican legislature to do something, and you're putting up, the pictures of Democratic legislatures on your first page. Don't do that. You're trying to persuade here. And so what was your question again on the something about industrial prison complex, and then I lost my mind. Yeah, lovely. So I would fall back, and a great question is I'd fall back on the holistic approach of first of corrections, but then with an understanding that, corrections isn't the tail end. It's really part of the continuum of the whole process, and it has to be integrated So in the military, we used to actually have, one of our best corrections executives would go speak at the TJAG or the JAG school, Judge Advocate General School, of future judges and future prosecutors to give a corrections perspective so they'd understand our environment as it related then to their professional that. So first incorporated in the whole system, and probably different than the perspective of just the incarceration is that holistic view of absolutely, yes, I'll do the justice side of what is required of me, but I want to do the mercy side. In my living room, I have a frame thing of ancient wisdom that says, what does the Lord require of me? But to do justly, to love mercy, and walk humbly with my God. To me, that's a pretty decent approach for a correctional agency. Probably that last part, has to be worked into everybody's faith or humanistic traditions. But, justice and mercy, that being a holistic approach, not an either or. And so I think recognizing that correctional agencies are a reflection of the legislature, actually. It's the laws of the state. So the representatives of the state, define so much, set the boundaries. I certainly did not hesitate to do a lot of closed doors meeting. In fact, that was a requirement I had when I went to Florida, when I interviewed with the governor-elect, was to have unfettered access to the legislature, because I didn't have that as the director of the Bureau of Prisons. And so to me, that was absolutely necessary, because that's how you then you got to shape the laws. You have to convince your executive branch, that they're the ones that give you the orders. But the folks you really go after is the legislature and teach them. We were able to, after a 17-year hiatus of a law, we were able to reinstitute the Inmate Welfare Trust Fund, which, without running a rabbit hole with you all on concessioned activities within prisons, the profits of that in most systems actually go back into programming. In Florida, they were swept into the general fund. And so we fought very hard my first year to bring the law back to have that authority, so that in each subsequent year, then it's just a fight of what percentage of the concession that comes back to the state goes directly to inmate welfare programs. So one more to this side, and then we'll start on that side. Okay, yes, sir. Yeah, so the Florida specific, because we actually had a law in Florida that if anybody tested, what's called the tape test, tested at a 5th grade or lower, I was mandated by law to provide 150 hours of basic literacy prior to anything else, really. So that's why there's some figures absolutely burned into my brain, and that the overall reading level is 6th grade level. Yeah. Okay, comes, ma'am.
So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how reform within the civilian justice system.
Oh, okay. So military, we don't reform. And no, it's a joke. How far did I just broadcast that? I was going to say, about to get a call from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Used to work for him. Anyways, the tough comparison, because reform in the civilian sector isn't homogeneous in any way, shape, or form. So there's a lot about the military justice system that frankly is commendable and was trailblazing in comparison to many state systems, and certainly when you start getting county, you can get some amazing frameworks at the county level. So I'm not sure I can give you a good answer, just because I don't think that comparison lays out. There is a lot of advantages in the military system. Most of those I incarcerated were, if they weren't first-time offenders, There are first-time caught offenders because we have such a efficient way of removing soldiers from service, especially in the last 15 years or so. That then carried us being part of the Veteran Justice Commission, created these second and third order effects of how quickly we separated folks with other than honorable or general discharges and just didn't deal with all those issues that should have been dealt with. A lot more challenges. And again, the military correction system is well resourced. If you want to see a model correctional institute, actually go to the United States Disciplinary Barracks at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, maximum security prison. Everybody's taking college courses, taking great vocational training programs. We have one of the largest mental health departments actually in the Army is right there, resident. It's remarkable what right looks like when the system is funded correctly, because you don't see that in a lot of correctional agencies. So, ma'am.
My first question is there an interactive process between prisoners and the parole process outside of students?
So yes, if you're asking for personal experience, I would say yes. One is I encouraged our incarcerated population to write me. We had a whole process where, the letter would come. Obviously, I had a staff entity would take them, would read them first to make sure, because sometimes what was being written, frankly, was intelligence leads. So they'd copy it and make sure that group got it. A lot of the letters would be, I'd rather be in a different prison. And so it'd go to the classification folks. But anyways, they would still all come. Then after being scanned in, I had a separate file for my reading. And whenever I'd have a meeting canceled or, when things slowed down during the holiday season, I'd catch up. Frankly, I'd always be about 400 behind. But I would read them and I would divide it between those that were just personal requests, and I knew staff would address it appropriately within our system. So when you're executive leadership, what you do is you set up systems because you can't do it all yourself. And so, and then you trust your systems. You back check it, but you trust them. Then there would be those that would be recommending huge changes to criminal justice. A lot of letters came in on Florida reinstituting parole, which is, we're one of the half of the states of our nation that do not do parole anymore. And me personally, I'm an absolute fan of parole as a correctional profession. Having the incentive of parole impacts behavior, absolutely. And I'll work that if I had it. Didn't have it in Florida. And we also had a law of, I always love it happens again on both sides out. See, truth in sentencing law would be the way one side would say it, would certainly be categorized differently from the other side. But, with our, again, earned credits, whatever term you want to use for earning time off, they would blow past the mandatory minimum. And so, somebody would actually have days in the bank to spend in indiscipline and still get out at, 15% early, which is, again, the way Florida does it. So, if you're in a system where leadership is receptive for this input, then absolutely. When I would go and do visits to our correctional institutions, I'd always make a point of going into at least a couple of the housing units and just doing an impromptu sensing session. And I would always ask the men or women who their representative was. And rarely did they know, or who their senator was, their state. And I'd go, where are you from? I'm from, and they'd say, from wherever. And I say, I know who your representative is. How is it that I know it and you don't know who your own representative is? And I'd say, you should be writing them. they're the ones, because they would always ask me what the status, what I would think of it, because every year there is a law that's introduced to reduce it to 65%, the mandatory minimum. And I said, don't tell me, tell your representative. So I would encourage them to be part of the political discourse that way. And then I'd remind them of all the privileged communication that they do have. Then they're suing. That immediately becomes a competition. The moment it goes into court, I'll just say from a secretary's perspective, the moment it goes into court, we are now competing. And we are not working towards a solution. Now, yes, there's the settlement, and working, can we figure this out before it actually goes to jury? There's all that process, but I'm not doing that. That's now all being done by lawyers. And I'm not even speaking publicly about it. The only public case that I spoke out on it was the DOJ report on our women's institution at Lowell. If anybody did your Google search to see, I hope your opinion of me isn't based on the Miami Herald. I hope. It would be bad for my self-esteem. But no, that report was so horribly done, and then attempted to be used to cause an out-of-court settlement. We fought it. Absolutely, we fought it. And part of fighting it was me making public statements, let alone legal representation, doing the very unusual act for the government agency to lay out your argument in the public sphere before ever going even towards settlement. That is an unusual thing. Usually we're just punching bags until such time it hits that part of the court. We weren't on that one. So you're referencing what more? What? Oh yeah. So just real quick on that one, is very common in correctional institutions is to have some type of advisory council from your incarcerated population. Very common, when I was a commandant, so a warden of the USDB years ago, I had an inmate advisory council which had a representative from each housing unit. We met quarterly. We, being military, I would make them do actual proposal papers. And then, the first time I said that, they handed me like 15 of them, at which point I handed them all back and say, and choose the two most important. In 3 months, you can give me your next two. And that's the whole time I was there, that's how I did that. And I found that very, very valuable. And so we encourage that. New wardens, for some reason, sometimes don't think that's good. I think it's just an initial insecurity, but most recognize that as very positive. Okay, your second question. Mm-hmm. Wow, gosh, there's some more qualified people in this room to answer that question than I. Though a very legitimate question to ask somebody that's headed an agency. Boy, so first, I think it starts with a recognition of the challenge. And that, if you ever thought, and I won't even put this in the mental health form, if you ever thought that humans are rational, you haven't worked in corrections or with students. Anyways, and but so the aspect of first being aware of the inherent challenges, you have some with serious mental issues that actually, surprisingly, do better within the regimentation of general population or units that are designed to address the issues. You have some that absolutely cannot function in that way. So so you have to create in your system the ability to deal with both and deal with all the variances in between. So like in my case, when I got to Florida, they recognized they had a shortage of like the crisis stabilization unit, think actual mental health institutional hospital capability, and an actual institutional bed with the direct care. And the plan was actually to renovate some dorms, because you do some structural changes to work that population, but they were going to build it in Suwannee County. Now, do you know the song? Way down upon the Suwannee River. Again, we have a different generation. That's actually not even my generation, but it's as rural as that song sounds. And wasn't going to be psychologists coming from Suwannee County to be able to. So the first thing in the first year I did was to convince the legislature, you have to spend more money and actually build a mental health prison hospital where I can get professional staff. And so we're building it, and it was a place that I had identified. We had some horribly old structures that needed to be demolished. So for me, it was a twofer. I got rid of old facilities and got the money to build a new prison hospital. Ground's broken, it's being built now. I think it's going to be a national standard in its design construction. It was a design build that involved psychologists, in the design process. And I think it's going to be phenomenal, which will take up to 550 of our, frankly, most challenging cases. And this will be amazing for the system, because managing, I don't know if this is a bad way to say it, the mentally fragile within general population can cause real challenges for the rest of the population, where it's worth it in some cases. In other cases, it's just overly challenging. So if taking, especially for those that manifest in violent behavior, being able to have that, and then we build in it, there's diversion, like before you get there, that you're hoping your system is able to do that. And we have those, throughout our system, especially if we can keep them close to where their families are in the system. Diversion, or if it's on the tail end of that prison, would be the step down capability. So as a secretary, of course, I'm looking at it as a big system. Without, I wouldn't even begin to call myself a mental health professional, though I have certainly been the recipient of their good work in my personal life and in my marriage. So I love them to death. So and appreciate what they can do within a system. But it's started with, I had to go get the money, and we did. It was the argument for that. Ma'am. Okay.
The first one.
Wait, name, please.
Oh, I'm Ian.
Thank you.
What's been the most effective corrections you've seen in life?
Most effective corrections reform I've seen. Well, if you want to go historic, when we left the penitentiary system, which again, only the Federal Bureau of Prisons still uses that term, I think. Quiet reflection is important, but that's not enough. Now, that's worth. Okay. So one that has impressed me a lot, and I see great potential, was the introduction of seminary programs inside of corrections. Who knew it would start in a place, like Angola, Louisiana. So we've done several of those programs in Florida, and what was so powerful about that program, 4-year full academic program, funded not by the state, funded by generous donors, that at the end of that program, you now have men and women that can serve as field representatives, supporters, mentors. You run the length of the names. and work inside the system. You know, I think some of the best reform happens when it's inside the system and it grows in the system. You know, so where the graduates now this was risk on our part, security-wise, but can you imagine this free access into restricted housing to just be someone to listen at the cell door of the men and women in restricted housing? The legitimacy that they have, that, you know, as great as a psychologist or social worker can be, you know, think of the legitimacy of a fellow man or woman that's incarcerated can have when you know, dealing one-on-one, and it just expanded the numbers of people that we had that could do this type of programming. And there's a lot of examples like that. But so I guess for me, you know, I suspect you wanted me to go into the political side maybe, or some of the, you know, I'm not going to stand up and say, no, we should all do the Norway model. No, we should not. But that can be a different discussion if you want to have it. But you know, some of these programs have had just an amazing impact. If you haven't picked up on it, I am a great advocate for volunteer program of bringing community behind the wire. Because if you don't want it to be a cold handoff, the relationship has to start during the period of incarceration, so that, you know, that it's not a bus ticket getting them home. I would, you know, my vision was always, I want either a family member, a friend, or a volunteer meeting that man or woman on the day that they leave incarceration, and they know they're going to be met there. And so it's a warm handoff to a relationship always being there. I had a chance, I don't know if any of you have ever heard of the Death or Prison podcast. Have you heard it? Okay, worth writing down. Easy to find on YouTube. I heard about it as, again, one of those, reading the thousands of emails I got, was somebody saying, hey, Secretary, you should check out this podcast. So it was early on when they had just started. Yeah, so I clicked it on, I'm listening to the podcast, and very quickly realized these were former Florida Department of Corrections men that one had been released 17 years ago, one had been released about 9 years ago, and one had just gotten out like 6 months ago. And they were doing this podcast under what was the organization? It's basically under Alpha Prison Ministries. So the Alpha Group, I think that's Anglican or Episcopal, sponsored that. But I think it was USA.org, maybe something. But anyways, easy to find them. But I started listening, and their audience really was to the incarcerated population. And I'm going, well, that's interesting. And we were eventually able to get their podcast on the tablets for our whole population. But I'm listening to them, and I'm going, I need to meet these guys. You know, so they were down in South Florida. One of them was up in Tampa, so I had to work through his probation officer, so he could go down and we met down at the studio, and it was one sitting. It turned into, if you want to see me, episodes 23, 24, and 25. Can you imagine, as a secretary, trying to speak to your incarcerated population, family members, and the entire civilian community, to include legislatures, all on the same podcast? If you want to see how I manage that, episode 23, 24, and 25 is that. But yeah, again, I can't remember the question that caused me to think of that podcast. What other questions do you have for me, sir? Mayor.
My name is Peter Keith. I'm here at the generous invitation of my dear friend, Cannon. Here's my question.
Yes, sir.
How might community members engage with released convicts when most news outlets, that includes the entire spectrum, focus on fear of the formerly incarcerated inmate?
Great question.
I'm looking at this as a community member or community leader, and through the focus of having been a licensed psychiatric technician,
Mm-hmm.
serving at the Atascadero State Hospital for the criminally insane, and prior to that at Napa State Hospital.
Oh, great question, and thanks for asking that. So that would fall into, what I think is a core competency or core mission set again for corrections is restoration, meaning defined for those within my agency is working with intent with community to facilitate that reentry process. And part of that is an education. So if you ever work in government, you're going to have a love-hate relationship with your strategic communications director and your general counsel, but that's a whole nother story. But with your public affairs, there's certain things they do not want to talk about. And one of them is corrections. I don't know if every one of them, they must say it in school. There's no good story in corrections. So the only stories that are making it into the public sphere are the bad stories. And in any organization, so in Florida, I had 24,000 employees, actually 28, then we had COVID, so it went down. But with that many employees, there's going to be some bad stories. There's just going to be some bad stories. If that's the only stories the community is seeing, is both the stories of negative interaction between staff and the incarcerated population, or the actions, because trust me, if I had somebody out on probation and they committed a serious crime, I had Florida sheriffs with big boards doing, news conferences saying how they had caught this person on probation, and then obviously this is in some counties, not other counties, and having this fear-inciting public affairs strategy that just worked against effective reentry. And so I guess the first thing, and it's on government side, is tell this, public affairs strategic communication, we are going to put out the good stories too. And there are such good stories. Again, I have a love-hate relationship with the media because, they wouldn't put the good stories out. So I would actually negotiate with at least the neutral reporters. I mean, there's some reporters that they are just trying to get a Pulitzer Prize, and they will paint any situation in its worst to get the notoriety because they want that Pulitzer Prize. There's others that appeared to have some values that I could at least connect with. And so those are the ones I would, yes, we absolutely rated our media based on their past activities and the fairness of their covering. And so those that I gave actual in-person interviews, I'll give you an example of one of them. She really wanted to understand our incarceration of female inmates in light of, again, that DOJ report. So we didn't go to, I said, okay, I will give you that interview, but not at that facility. I want you to do it at this facility, and I will only do the interview if you let me show you one of our programs we've instituted. So that's the agreement we made. So I did an on-camera interview talking about, again, we did fight that DOJ report done by CRIPA on the Lowell facility. But the program I took her into was, this is something I instituted in Florida is, so in Florida, anybody with a year and a day goes to state prison. And that's even if you have pretrial credit. So you could have 2 months and you're still infinitely being sent upriver, to the state prison. And the system was, you come into the reception center, and within a couple of weeks, you went to one of 50 prisons, meaning we scattered the short sentenced inmates across our entire system. Now, because they're short sentenced, they're generally low custody, so they're immediately going into dorms. They're not going into 2-person cells. So immediately going into dorms, 70 people in there. Can you see anything going wrong with that? Somebody comes into a dorm for 5 months. And the next buck over is somebody on a life sentence, somebody who had this crime, that crime. Can you see that going wrong? Those are the persons, they were being victimized, meaning they were being extorted. You must pay rent for your bed. Your family, because they're terrified. Your family needs to have money, send in money, or you're not going to be safe. Your family has to bring in drugs through visitation. And it better get to my desk. It was a whole system, frankly, of taking advantage of our short sentence inmates. So I decided to change that and did not send anybody with a sentence of a year or less to general population. We created our own short sentence communities. We redesigned the programs for the amount of time we had them available to us at the 5 locations. And then what we added, and I actually did a letter to our incarcerated population, said, I'm looking for volunteers of long sentenced inmates who can help us design a course to mentor short sentence inmates. And I said, tell me why you should be the person, send it through your classification officer to your warden, we'll build the team. And so we had 8 men, 2 women. To the surprise of my staff, they became a working group, all 10 together, under our careful eye, and but actually worked with our program staff to design a mentorship program. And then we did a mentorship academy because we were going to use about 150 to 200 long sentence inmates who their character was not reflective of the worst day of their life. We had watched them for 20 years, and they were frankly amazing. And I wanted them to be the mentors to hopefully break the cycle of the short sentenced inmates. A lot of people say, a whole bunch of people do life sentences, 6 months at a time. Now try to break that cycle with the advice and the wisdom of these men and women in their 40s and 50s. So I wanted that reporter to see that. And it was that important. So he came in, the mentors and 2 mentorees, gave their presentation. And this is the first time I'd been back to that location in about 6 months. And, I was emotionally overwhelmed at the presentation, something I didn't even think of. Because when we first brought the 10 men and women together, I met with them and I said, this is my vision. Make it better than anything I can imagine. And gave them the freedom to do so. And they did. And so something I had never crossed my mind is the number of short sentenced women that are incarcerated, how many of them have lost custody of their children. And in Florida, we have rules, different department, DCF, Department of Child and Family, that require, you're gonna have to cut me off whenever you wanna cut me off, okay? Yeah. Okay, got it. So I love talking about the programs we instituted. So they're talking about, so they had actually worked, and we had gotten the approved curriculum that DCF required for certain classes that was necessary before women could petition to have their children back in custody. And so we were doing it right there. I'm just sitting there, jaw dropping and hearing the mentorees, and they we're to have meeting, and so they would, it was just a kind of a different language as I was watching these long sentenced women working with these typically younger women that over 70% of them had been victims of sexual assault or domestic abuse. Many of them forced into the drug trade as mules. Some of them still being hounded by their pimps, with the intent of, once they got out, to reintroduce them into sex trafficking. And seeing how these generally younger women were reacting to what almost would become, a mother or an auntie type relationship, and what they had actually designed the course. And I was frankly hearing that part for the first time. At the end of it, I tried to do a lovely, as you would expect, secretary speech at the end, and I just go, I just said, ladies, I'm overwhelmed. I just have to go over in the corner and regain my composure. And I turned to the reporter and said, they're all yours. And the article that came out was almost decent. So I think agencies have to work with intent, unfortunately, to get the message out, but community leaders can help. And part of that is an encouraging active volunteerism inside the facility. Once you get inside correctional institutions, you see a lot of people that are at the worst place in their life. And they are looking for a relationship. They are looking for, they're looking for hope and looking for a way to succeed, not that day for certainly, but as they approach time return into the community. And the more people that have experiences, if you talk to volunteers, why do we have volunteers that have been doing it for 25 years? It's because the richness of the experience, once they finally went inside the wire and got over the fear, has had that kind of impact. I mean, again, Florida, you probably aren't picking this up from the news you watch. 9,000 volunteers, defined as at least 6 visits per year inside the facility to do whatever program they're doing. 9,000. And they came back after COVID. The goal that I gave when I first got there, unfortunately COVID got in the way, was Florida actually used to have 20,000 volunteers. And then they instituted some dorked up bureaucratic methods that just made it too hard, because most of your a lot of your volunteers are going to be retirees. And if you make things too hard, it's just going to be too hard to get through the bureaucracy. You got to make it easy to get people behind the wire. It's a risk, but if it increases my contraband by 5%, okay, I will take that trade-off any day. What was that risk reward thing there? I'll take an increase of contraband by 5% to have, another 5,000 volunteers any day of the week. So who wants the last question? Ma'am. The root cause, original sin? That would be my faith answer. Again, my best answers come talking about corrections part of it. I think every profession has to take a hard look at itself, at its core values, its defined competencies, and how it encourages commitment within it. So, the speech. After that, money has a big impact on any system. Florida used to have one of the leading correction systems in the nation, one of the first corrections system to be accredited back in the 1980s. Their programmatics in the 90s, again, their volunteerism were amazing. Now, I'm not saying it didn't have its issues too. Cool Hand Luke was filmed out here in California. That was about Florida. It's based on a book written by a Florida inmate. And in the scene, please tell me you've all seen Cool Hand Luke. Am I speaking to, otherwise we're having a failure to communicate here. So thank you. A laugh came from that. But it is the first thing I did when I got there is I looked at the budget for the last 20 years of the department and determined, it was an ever decreasing budget against inflation. It looks like it was going up, but it wasn't. It was actually going down in personnel authorizations. I mean, from 2000 to when I got to 2019, we had cut 600 educators. We had 287 left. Tennessee only has 10 prisons, has 287 authorized educators. 5 times bigger than them, and I had the same number of teachers. That's a problem. And so, but it was all decisions made over time that was acceptable risk at the time, but unfortunately had brought us to, yes, I used the term a system in crisis. And if you want to see, and I could probably get away with this because I have a really decent pension out of the military. If you go to the Florida Department of Corrections website, look at the annual plan, just go over to newsroom, annual plan, it's easy to find. So make sure, so it'd be the one for, I guess, 1920. I'll look it up just to make sure I give you the right one. I was required by law to answer a bunch of questions and give to the legislatures, not that I thought a single one of them or their staff ever looked at them. Okay, and that might be a little harsh, but so what I did is I took the strategic plan we wrote and I attached it to my legislatively required annual report of statistics. And I made that chapter 5. So you had to get through chapter 1, 2, 3, and 4. And I put a lot of pictures in there so people would read it. But if you want to get an insight of how you try to cause system change, I offer it is a public document, and the big battle was getting it through the governor's office. I didn't care about the legislature. I had to get the governor to endorse it, and he did. And I had to fight through his staff and get the governor saying, we have to be this transparent of what has happened to this system, or we're not going to get the money to make it better. And to his credit, in spite of public persona stuff that you see all over the TV, every time I went into him with a merited argument, every single time I came out with what I wanted. So let me make that my concluding argument thing to you. Every time I went in, I had a merited argument. And every time I came out with what our agency needed. Thank you.